My presentation is an analysis of tolerance and support for liberal ideals across Canada. For the purposes of this presentation, I will be exploring the relationship between measures of tolerance and support for traditional liberal rights and the institutions which uphold these rights. Specifically, I would like to explore how the dependent variable of tolerance is explained by measures of the independent variable, support for liberal freedoms, and institutions which uphold these freedoms, and whether the results of such an exploration vary across the country. Methodologically, I will be performing secondary analysis on the National Survey of Legal Scholars and Professionals. In this analysis, I will construct an index measure of the dependent variable tolerance and draw three measures for the independent variable: level of trust in the Supreme Court, level of support for freedom of speech, and level of support for freedom of the press. The relationship between the dependent and independent variables will be measured by a correlation and regression analysis. Finally, I will control for region in order to explore the impact or lack of impact of region on my results. Tolerance and liberalism are both characteristics of Canadian public culture and are intuitively seen as interrelated. But these two public goods are expressed in different ways and need not, and indeed do not always across space and time, come in a single package. Tolerance is an ideal which finds its political expression in ways of thinking and acting, and despite the nomenclatural folly, it is best understood in a negative sense, i.e. as the absence of a political ideology which orders the interactions between citizens based on arbitrary distinctions. Liberalism as a political ideal, however, is institutionally expressed. Liberalism co-opts the fundamentality of law and therefore incorporates it as a central tenet in order to explore a series of basic rights which guarantee life in the state, freedom from arbitrary interference. Taken in historical perspective, liberal ideology preceded the public endorsement of an inclusive conception of humanity as a community comprised of fundamentally equal persons. Drawing on this historical perspective, this analysis seeks to explore whether liberalism explains tolerance. Based on measures of support for equal rights, equal treatment before the law, anti-racism, assimilation, and immigration, I have constructed an index to measure the dependent variable tolerance. As can be noted in the table, the constructed index for tolerance meets the critical alpha score of 0.6 and is therefore suitable for use. Correlation analysis rejects the relationship between tolerance and trust in the Supreme Court and support for freedom of the press, although these relationships remain slightly positive at 0.115 and 0.109, respectively. Correlation does, however, show moderate support for a relationship between support for freedom of speech and tolerance with a positive coefficient of 0.175. Similar to correlation, regression also rejects the relationship, as measured, between tolerance and trust in the Supreme Court and freedom of the press, which possess regression coefficients of 0.166 and negative 0.161 respectively. Again, the relationship between tolerance and support for freedom of speech is stronger at 0.581, which is significantly different from 0. As a result, I will proceed to explore the relationship between tolerance and support for freedom of speech. When controlling for organization into Cosmopolitan, French, and rest of Canada controls, which is Ontario and British Columbia for Cosmopolitan, Quebec for French, and then the rest of Canada, replication analysis appears to confirm the pattern of correlation between tolerance and support for freedom of speech, with the exception of the outlying case of French regions, which is exclusively Quebec for the purposes of this analysis. It should be noted that there are distinct problems for the French table, with an extremely low Tau-B statistic and a high chi-square statistic, while controlling for Cosmopolitan and the rest of Canada replicates the expected pattern with a Tau-B statistic of 0.278 for Cosmopolitan and 0.339 for the rest of Canada. Controlling for region also appears to replicate the relationship between tolerance and support for freedom of speech when controlling by West, Central, and East. Again, with a case including Quebec, manifesting a discrepancy in an otherwise visible pattern. Throughout, it should be noted the chi-square statistic is very high, indicating problems in the possibility of making inferences from this data. Again, the Tau-B statistic strongly supports this relationship where Quebec is excluded from the analysis, with 0.273 for East and 0.413 for West. Neither trust in the Supreme Court nor support for freedom of the press, as measured here, carries explanatory power on variation in individual levels of tolerance. Support for freedom of speech, however, does appear to partially explain these levels of tolerance. The relationship between support for freedom of speech and tolerance is replicated across Canada, with the exception of the outlying case of Quebec. This indicates that this relationship is part of the Canadian public culture, and not solely of particular parts of the state, which may be classified by cosmopolitan status or by region. The implications of these findings suggest that the historical separation between the institutional adoption of liberal tenets and the rise of toleration in the public culture may be the result of some fundamental difference between liberalism as a package and toleration as a public fact. But the stronger relationship between support for freedom of speech and tolerance indicates that aspects of liberalism may be necessary starting points from which toleration arises, which should be consistent with contemporary political theory. Future research should explore this question in greater depth. There are clear restrictions to the use of secondary analysis on the small sample size available in the National Survey of Legal Scholars and Professionals. In addition, Quebec provides a clear break with the larger pattern observed throughout this analysis, and future research should also direct attention to this discrepancy.